So, Scott, I hear that you have thoughts on a story about our future president, RFK Jr., and a bear. But I have purposefully
Bear
not
cub.
clicked on any of the links because I kind of don't want to know. But tell me, what is happening here?
It's been a tumultuous couple weeks in politics, a pretty entertaining one if you really appreciate political theater, but there really is nothing I've ever seen quite like the amazing video RFK released where he is explaining for some reason to Roseanne Barr the fact that he once took a dead bear cub, got a little hammered in New York and dropped, or I guess his friends got a little hammered in New York, according to him, not him, and then dropped it in Central Park.
Yeah, he swears he was entirely sober.
Certainly that's what the photo of him jamming his hand in this dead bear cub's mouth certainly suggests. It is the wildest thing I have ever heard.
What was the bear cub already dead? Did he kill a bear cub?
No, he did not kill the bear cub. He found the bear cub dead and decided...
that's a lot. That's important.
And then he collected the bear cub because that's what you do when you find a dead bear cub. You put it in your car. And then he brought it to New York City because that's what you do with a dead bear cub. And then he had a dinner to get to or a flight to catch. I forget which it was, somewhere where you couldn't bring a dead bear cub. So he decided, as one does, to leave it in Central Park and make it look like it was the result of a bicycling accident, as one does.
I will just say the amazing part about this video is watching Roseanne Barr's face as she reacts to the story, because it's like she's not somebody you would expect to be able to genuinely shock and put in a position where she's like, I think I might be in over my head of all people in our nation. And yet that is distinctly the look on her face for the last like 3/4 of this video, just to the point where he picks up the bear. That's where she's looking a little upset. And then it goes a lot further than that. I mean, it's genuinely kind of amazing. And one of the best pieces of political theater I have seen this cycle yet. I can't wait to see what the next few months bring us.
Does it make you more or less likely to vote for him for president, Scott?
Now that I know that he didn't kill the bear, that makes it better.
It does a little bit. I don't know if it does. Playing with the dead bear is an odd
weird.
choice. And then saying maybe this is where I got the worm in my brain in the New Yorker article.
Oh, the brain.
which was kind of amazing.
Circle. RFK Jr., not the president we need, but the president we could possibly deserve.
Possibly. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rational Security. I am one of your regular co-hosts, Scott R. Anderson. Thrilled to be back with two of my other regular co-hosts, Alan Rosenstein.
Hello.
And Quinta Jurassic.
Hello.
And thrilled as well to be joined once again by our regular co-host, stand-in / special guest / co-host emeritus, Benjamin Wittes. Ben, thank you for coming back on the show.
Yo.
Yeah, well, we're not that thrilled having you here either. Don't worry about it.
A man who needs no introduction more than Benjamin Wittes. Thrilled to have you back on this week in what has been a week of a lot of big national news stories, national security news stories. After several weeks of politics eating up the bandwidth in the news, still kind of doing that, let's be honest, with the VP pick coming out this week. Nonetheless, a lot is happening in the rest of the world.
Minnesota.
I knew you were going to be excited about this sound.
You betcha.
Regardless, as Minnesota nice as it would be to talk about that, we're going to skip over and focus on some of the national security news and the stories that we are talking about, because a lot is going on around the world that's worth digging into in what we are calling the Exit Pursued by a Bear Cub edition, in honor of our perhaps soon to exit or be effectively ousted presidential candidate RFK Jr., with some of the other news this week that we don't have quite as much time to talk about. For our first topic, the waiting game. The Middle East is on edge this week as it waits a possible attack by Iran or Hezbollah on Israel in response to the suspected assassination of senior Hezbollah and Hamas leaders last week, including the chairman of Hamas's political bureau, Ismail Haniyeh, who was killed while visiting Tehran for the swearing in of its new president. What might a response look like if there is one, and what does it mean for the region, including the prospects of a Gaza ceasefire? Topic 2. Stay weird, Austin. Just days after the announcement of a long-negotiated plea deal for 3 of the 4 remaining defendants in the military commission trial relating to the 9/11 attacks, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin took the surprising and still largely unexplained move of intervening to rescind that deal and remove the convening authority that had approved it. What can explain Austin's actions? What will they mean for the future of the military commissions? And topic 3, a favorable exchange rate. In a surprise move, the Biden administration and several European allies concluded a massive prisoner exchange with Russia last week, which resulted in the release of 16 detained U.S. and European nationals, as well as several Russian dissidents, among them Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan. In exchange, Russia received 8 Russian agents, including convicted assassin Vadim Krasikov. Is this a win for the Biden administration, and what does it tell us about the state of hostage politics now and in the future? For our first topic, Quinta, let me hand it over to you to get us started.
So as you say, Scott, things have been rather tense in the Middle East following the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh. Iran has, I believe, promised that there will be some kind of response. There have been some indications that it might be substantially more serious than the last response that Iran sent to Israel, which involved sort of a number of drones and only a very small number of civilian casualties, sadly, 2 civilians in the Negev desert. Hamas has now elected a new leader, Yahya Sinwar, who is, of course, previously the leader of Hamas's military wing, who's responsible for the October 7th attacks. So things are not looking great, I would say. There's as always, a lot of different threads to pull apart here, but just to start things off, I mean, I'm curious, Ben, Scott, for both of your takes, why Israel conducted this assassination in the first place. Obviously, Israel loves to, conduct highly targeted assassinations. They're very good at it. I confess I was somewhat confused at why they would have targeted Haniyeh, given that he was reportedly one of the parties that was engaged in negotiations over the remaining hostages held in Gaza.
Well, I mean, the cynic would say you target Haniyeh because he was involved in the negotiations, and Netanyahu, though he has articulated 2 separate war aims, the destruction of Hamas and the freeing of the hostages, in fact, clearly privileges the first war aim over the second. And so if you have an opportunity to conduct the destruction of Hamas's leadership in a fashion that makes it harder to delay the first war aim at the expense of the second, you do that. I actually suspect that is not the reason, but that is certainly a plausible theory. I think the real explanation here is that this is a very good example of the no-win situation that Israel is in. So if you think about the alternative that Israel faces, and we have talked about this, Scott and I, on Rational Security before. One is, you kind of go into Gaza and you try to take out the entire military infrastructure of Hamas. And the consequence of that is devastating civilian casualties. And there's really no way to do it that doesn't involve devastating numbers of civilian casualties. And the other alternative is, which has been urged upon the Israelis by people like the administration, and we've discussed here, is what if you focus on leadership level strikes more exclusively and try to do more of the decapitation kind of operations and less of the infrastructure operations. You weight it more in that department. And the problem is then you run into this problem of, first of all, you end up operating in places like Iran, or in Lebanon, or in other countries. And the second is that when you do that, you escalate in a different way, right? The problem isn't civilian casualties, although there were apparently civilian casualties in the Haniyeh strike. The problem is a wider capacity for escalation, particularly with Iran. And when you operate in Lebanon, with Hezbollah, which is, of course, in a military sense, a very, very fearsome foe in a way that Hamas is not. And so I think it is a good example of the absolute no-win situation that the IDF finds itself in. But I would not exclude the possibility that one reason that Hania is an attractive target is that he is the political alternative. Now, when I say political alternative, I don't want it to sound like this is not a legitimate military target. Ismail Hania is leadership level, at the, he's a guy with a lot of blood on his hands, and Hamas doesn't have a neat distinction between the military and the political or civilian side. And so, Hania was certainly aware of October 7th before it happened. He's spoken about how they want to do it over and over again. And so I think it's it's not like an organization that has a civilian architecture that is independent of its military infrastructure. And if you're serious about wiping out Hamas, which, if the last 8 months have shown anything, it's that the Israeli government is serious about wiping out Hamas, taking out Ismail Hania is a legitimate component of that.
So I disagree with that, or maybe I disagree with the weighting given to those explanations. I think the explanations are kind of on a spectrum, but I don't find the difficult position the Israelis are in to be a persuasive explanation for this particular move, at least compared to the provocation move. And if anything, I actually think this is a sign of the weird strength and political position Israel, and particularly Netanyahu, finds themselves in as an ability to act as a provocateur in a pretty disruptive way, which he's done pretty routinely for really the last 20 years, but particularly in the last few years. This is a case where he's indisputably a bad gentleman, but also someone who does not appear to have been operationally that involved with a lot happening in Hamas and the Gaza Strip in terms of the combat. I mean, he's been living in Qatar most of the last, 8 years or so, a little longer, I believe. The political bureau has a fair amount of separation between a lot of the actual militant activities happening on the ground, which Sinwar is much more involved in. As far as we understand it. It doesn't mean he wasn't involved on October 7th or anything that comes after it, but it does mean that the case for this being, operationally necessary or providing a huge operational advantage in terms of the campaign on the ground, I think is actually a case that needs to be made, because I'm not sure that's clear that's there. Meanwhile, we do know the clear downsides. You're assassinating your negotiating partner. In indirect negotiations. You did in Tehran in this case, by the way, at the inauguration of an individual and a figure who was elected as a more moderate figure to the new presidency of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian. We shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that's going to radically change the direction of the regime. That's not how Iran works. But nonetheless, it's a figure that regional stability would benefit from having their position bolstered. And instead, you're humiliating them pretty much from day one. Yes, this is a facility maintained by the IRGC that maybe in some ways could give this individual some leverage, but his ability to do any sort of rapprochement with the United States, with Israel, with a lot of other countries, just became a lot more constrained for the foreseeable future because of this incident, as evidenced by the fact that they are threatening some sort of military response. And the truth is that lots of allies of Israel don't want this to happen, object to this happening. We have lots of reporting of just how enraged Biden and lots of his senior advisors were, but they can't do that much publicly about it because Hania is a bad guy and Hamas is a terrorist group. And this sort of action is probably going to be pretty popular with Israel domestically, meaning a lot of opposition figures in the Netanyahu government who favor a ceasefire still are going to have a lot of trouble criticizing him over it. Netanyahu essentially has a kind of dominant hand in this regard. He can take this provocative action knowing none of the people that matter can really criticize him that harshly for it, even though it disrupts the process that they are working towards that they are not, or that he is not, which is the ceasefire arrangement. I really think this has to be viewed through the lens as a very provocative action. It doesn't mean there aren't strategic reasons you might want to target Hania that might be legitimate. Although again, I think a case needs to be made for that. But those reasons strike me as barring a very, very strong case on facts not known to us, seem really, really outweighed by the provocative nature of this action, which has only one result, which is to delay and further obstruct ceasefire negotiations, as evidenced by the fact that Hamas's negotiating role has now been handed off to the guy who orchestrated the October 7th attacks in a much more direct way, Yahya Sinwar, who seems much more willing to entertain more harsh conditions and terrible consequences for the people of Gaza, because that was the inevitable consequence of October 7th. That was what he was seeing in the first place. So it doesn't seem like a ceasefire has gotten any easier, if anything, much, much harder at this point. And it's entirely a foreseeable consequence of these actions.
Yeah, so I don't think we are disagreeing. I think this is a situation where Israeli and U.S. interests have substantially diverged. I don't think Israel wants a ceasefire. I think Israel wants to pick off the Hamas leadership and the Hezbollah leadership one by one in an opportunistic fashion, and continue destroying the military infrastructure of Hamas on the ground in Gaza. And they want to delay a ceasefire, even at the expense of the lives of their own hostages, for as long as possible. And I think they're being pretty open about that. And I think the U.S. interest is to have a ceasefire and a hostage deal as quickly as possible. And I think now the interesting question is whether this is a Netanyahu and Israeli right policy divergence with the United States, or whether this is a broader Israeli policy divergence. And there is considerable evidence that a lot of the military establishment is closer to where Scott is, and where the Biden administration is, and that Netanyahu is being something of a rogue actor here. But I do think the sense that the Israelis should continue to live with Hamas is just a point that is much more obvious in the United States than it is in Israel. And when Israelis talk about this, their balance of equities is very different from the one that Scott just laid out. Theirs is all about recovering the hostages, not about a sort of, to a little smaller extent, rapprochement with the Biden administration. But there's not a sense of, there's no doubt among most Israeli analysts that, picking off the leadership of Hamas, one by one in a fashion that is, very similar really to what we did with Al-Qaeda in the Fatah through the drone strikes period in 2009 and 2010 and 11. That is an intuitive proposition to a lot of Israelis.
Yeah, I did want to ask about the kind of question of the different dynamics within the Israeli government here, because as we've all been reminded that the Israeli government is not a unitary actor. There are a lot of factions pulling in a lot of different directions.
The ultimate non-unitary executive.
I wasn't going to make that joke, but there you have it. Right. I mean, I feel like early in the war, there were very vocally expressed tensions between the sort of Netanyahu wing that really wanted to prosecute the war as aggressively as possible, and this other wing, which, as far as I understood, included a lot of the IDF, which was more focused on returning hostages. I mean, so I have wondered whether or not this strike and the previous strikes indicated a sort of more bellicose shift on the part of the IDF as an institution, or maybe Netanyahu, pulling everyone along with him. Do you have a sense one way or another of what this might mean?
Well, so this is a complicated example of that. So on the one hand, Benny Gantz, the centrist figure within the coalition, left. And so that tension was resolved within the government, though not within the national security establishment, by Benny Gantz walking away. And it is still definitely the case that a lot of IDF and security establishment people want a deal, and Netanyahu doesn't want a deal. That said, killing Ismail Haniyeh and operating in Iran specifically is a matter of a greater degree of political consensus in Israel than you might think. The idea that Israel kills Hamas leadership is not especially politically controversial. And when Israelis talk about, what their alternatives are, it's not fight or don't fight. It's, focus on Gaza or focus on leadership level stuff. And so, I don't know if Lapid or Benny Gantz is prime minister or another right-wing figure, Naftali Bennett, who is much more interested in consensus in the Israeli political establishment than Netanyahu is. I don't know whether they take this strike or not. It might well be that Scott is absolutely right, that they would say, okay, we have a chance at this guy, but we're going to pass it up because it'll infuriate the Biden administration and because it's potentially escalatory and because we actually don't want to assassinate our negotiating partner. The other possibility, though, is that there isn't a whole lot of history, at least that I'm aware of Israel having a shot at major Hamas leadership figures and not taking it. And that's been sort of true across political administrations. And so I'm kind of agnostic as to whether this is a Netanyahu poking everybody in the eye situation or really just more of a situation where Israel's interests as it perceives them are just different from the rest of the world's perception.
So on this topic, I like Quinta am largely in question asking mode. So I want to ask another question of you two, which is to zoom out and say, so are we all going to war in the Middle East? Because it's great to talk about the sort of specifics of this, and it's obviously very important. But at least what I was reading, last week was an increasing sense that, war with Hezbollah, war with Iran, a big real Middle Eastern war is getting, I don't want to say inevitable, but we are getting much, much closer.
So I would say it's definitely a possibility. This is going to be a flashpoint, and a particularly dangerous one for a lot of reasons, including that it has a bearing on the U.S. presidential election cycle that's ongoing over the next few months, that something could erupt. The fact that it hasn't yet, though, might be a sign that there are countervailing factors in play here. We know the United States has somehow, over the last few months, actually gotten to a state of a bit of a rapprochement with a lot of Iran and a lot of Iranian actors, where while hostilities are ongoing, they've been at a little bit of a lower level. We haven't seen major attacks against U.S. forces and diplomatic presences in Iraq until about a week ago, where we saw another pretty horrible attack in Al-Assad. Before that, we'd had a relatively quiet couple of months, small-scale incidents here and there, but nothing at the scale of what had been prior to January. Houthi military campaign ongoing against shipping traffic, but not quite at the scale, and the U.S. military response hasn't been at the same scale either. But again, that stepped up again a couple of weeks ago. So there does seem to be some ability that the United States and probably European allies has to prevail upon Iran to how it responds and how it targets these things. And some willingness on Iran's part to at least cabin or channel its responses in certain ways that it sees as more or less beneficial for a variety of reasons. Here, the United States has made clear a major escalation directly against Israel, certainly by Iran, is probably going to trigger a major U.S. military response, or very well might. And that is a very strong signal to Iran, and a reason why, if you see something, I think it's probably going to be it'll be significant, and I think they almost certainly have to do something, but it'll be a largely symbolic action, kind of like we saw the rocket attack on Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq after the Soleimani strike, or the last round of attacks in April involving lots of drones. Deadly, serious, something to take serious, but not the same thing as launching a serious concerted military campaign, kind of like a one-off attack that then is let lie, and perhaps the United States and Israelis will be able to let it lie. If that happens. Hezbollah is a little different. There's always ongoing hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel. Hezbollah will take some strikes, take some actions and attacks. Hopefully nothing, in the past, they've been things like hostage takings and captured Israeli soldiers that can lead to much bigger escalations. That hasn't been in play yet in this conflict. And my sense is that those things are less likely to arise given the current strategic posture of both groups in northern Israel and southern Lebanon. But It's certainly a possibility, but I think the most likely occasion is just a spike in hostilities between the two sides. But it would be I don't think either one of them really actually wants to tip this into a much bigger ongoing conflict yet. And I don't think this is enough of a game changer to do that. But it's closest that we've gotten recently. It's certainly a pretty significant action. It's going to trigger some sort of response. The real question is just, how escalatory that response will be, and then how much Israel, the United States, and others will escalate in response to it. Does that sound right to you, Ben? Do you have a different sense of this?
I agree with that in its entirety, with one caveat, which is I do think a major war between Israel and Hezbollah is inevitable. It's just a question of how long one can put it off and how long one wants to put it off. The circumstances of the end of the 2006 or 7, I can't remember which it was, 2006, I believe, Hezbollah war, which was a UN resolution that required Hezbollah to pull back its forces, which it never did, and the world never insisted on it, guarantees that a second confrontation will happen. Both sides expect that confrontation. And both sides know that confrontation will be quite devastating for themselves in a way that Hamas is actually not capable of doing. Hezbollah is an enormously capable force, and it has some quite serious weapons capability thanks to Iran. And so I do think, at some point, there will be a major war in southern Lebanon and northern Israel, and either side gets to decide whether that's a short-term issue or a long-term issue. And I don't think we know. Earlier in the Gaza conflict, it was very clear the Israelis wanted that war as soon as they dealt with Gaza. Now it is much less clear to me that they do, because the Gaza war has been more exhausting than I think people expected it to be. So, but with that caveat, I think that Scott has articulated the current scenario exactly correctly.
So moving from a current war in the Middle East to a previous war in the Middle East and its very, very long tail. So last week, Secretary of Defense Austin withdrew plea agreements that had been finalized or close to finalized, certainly approved by the convening authority, which is the military official who Austin previously put in charge of the military commissions at Guantanamo Bay. Plea agreements that would have resolved the cases of several of the 9/11 defendants, most notably Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, the kind of mastermind of 9/11, that would have resolved these cases with life in prison. We're still sort of figuring out what happened behind the scenes, but it sounds like, for whatever reason, Secretary Austin and his team were surprised when they heard that these plea agreements were happening. The surprise is itself surprising, given that it was well known that these plea agreements were in the works, and you would think that the Secretary of Defense would have a little more visibility into what was going on at these high-profile commissions. Nevertheless, he was surprised. He was getting blowback from Republicans in particular about what was viewed as the overly lenient treatment of these defendants, given that the death penalty was taken off the table as part of the plea agreement, as well as some pressure from some of the families of the 9/11 victims who wanted a trial and wanted the death penalty. Though, of course, it's important to note that there are also many families of 9/11 victims who want the opposite. They just want these plea agreements to go through to get some kind of closure. So he withdrew the plea agreements, and perhaps even more notably, he withdrew the convening authority's authority to even entertain these plea agreements or plea agreements in the future. So now the convening authority has essentially been demoted to a vice convening authority, where the real convening authority is the Secretary of Defense. So there's a lot to unpack here, but before we get into it, I actually want to start by asking you, Ben, can you just give us a brief refresher of this whole saga? Because it is worth noting, 9/11 was obviously in 2001, 23 years ago. It's just a crazy thing to say. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was captured 2 years later in 2003. The military commissions were established in 2011. I mean, so we're dealing with 1 decade delays on all of this. There's no question, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed himself does not actually dispute his innocence, or dispute his guilt, rather, more importantly, there's no question that he is in fact guilty of the crimes that he is charged with. So why is it that in the year of our Lord 2024, we're no longer not done with this trial? We're actually nowhere close.
Well, once upon a time, Alan Rosenstein.
Yeah, you have 3 minutes.
When you were a young high school student, a bunch of people in the Bush administration, supported by people like me, thought it would be a good idea to build an entirely new justice system to handle these terrorist trials. And
was it, Ben, was it just a full employment program for legal journalists and law professors and lawfare? Is this, you just knew that if we started military commissions, lawfare would just live forever?
Yeah, that was my motivation. I thought if I could trick them into creating a new justice system, I would have to write about for the rest of my life. No, that's not why they did it. And then separately, relatedly but separately, they also thought it would be a good idea to isolate a group of people in CIA custody and use really quite brutal means of extracting information from them. And those two decisions, in combination with one another, have made it nearly impossible to bring these people to trial, even though, as you rightly point out, young Alan Rosenstein, none of these people actually really disputes their guilt. And the result of these two decisions in tandem has made it, you know, you're kind of building an airplane that, while flying it, and that airplane has to decide how to handle evidence that is both very sensitive, involves a lot of secrets, and some of those secrets from the intelligence community involve the torture that the individuals were subjected to. And this has turned the entire system, which really isn't a system, in knots. The military commissions, and I say this as somebody who supported them to some degree with certain caveats, were a terrible mistake. They have not worked. And so what we've ended up doing is delaying justice. And there's one other element to this, which is, you know, a lot of people are philosophically committed to the death penalty for these particular people. And so the only solution, and I'm keeping this within your 3 minutes, is a plea deal that acknowledges their guilt in exchange for removing the death penalty from the table. And that is what the convening authority seems to have approved here. And that is what Lloyd Austin, apparently in response to protests from families and from brewing discontent from members of Congress, has now scotched. How'd I do? Did you like the fairy tale construction of it?
I thought it was great. I thought it was really charming. I'm definitely I'm going to tell this story to my kid tonight as for bedtime.
So I should say, so Natalie Orpett, our esteemed executive editor, I believe, as we record, is recording a podcast on all of these developments with General Baker, who was formerly the chief defense counsel at Guantanamo. And it will be very interesting to hear what he has to say as someone who was extremely up close and personal with a lot of this, although not during the events that that we're discussing here. I have to say, I mean, first off, just underlining what Ben said, this is so unbelievably discouraging. There's an Onion article that I always think about when we have these conversations. Ben is giving me a thumbs up. He knows exactly what I'm about to say about about Guantanamo, you know, building in wheelchair ramps and other services for, you know, elderly people, because of course the detainees are aging and need such accommodations. At the time, I don't even remember when that article came out. At the time, it was like a bleak joke. Now, I mean, like, that is what is going to happen. These people are going to die before they ever face any kind of sentence if we continue along the the road that we've continued. I mean, it's particularly discouraging because it's, as far as I can tell, as you say, Ben, this deal has the contours of what you would need to expect from a deal. And I find it particularly bewildering because it's unclear to me to what extent Austin would have known the specifics of what was going on here. The military commissions are, of course, part of the Defense Department, but there is a level of independence that is supposed to be built in. And my understanding, again, from Natalie, who's very familiar with this system, is that they do take the sort of the risk of unlawful command influence very seriously. So it's not clear to me to what extent Austin would have been sort of up close and personal with the negotiations, but he surely would have known that they were going on. And we have some sense of that because Harvey Rishikoff, who was the previous convening authority, was fired in 2017 or 2018 for negotiating a plea agreement exactly along these lines, which is sort of an indication that, the higher-ups are aware when these conversations are happening. So the fact that, there was certainly some level of awareness within the upper echelons of the Defense Department that this was going on, only to then, take a look at it and say, I'm shocked that there was gambling happening in this establishment, is really bewildering and makes me wonder whether there's something going on rather than just the pure sort of concern about political backlash, but whether there was some aspect of the plea that was not something that the department could stomach. It's impossible to know because we don't have the actual terms of the deal, right? Like the whole thing is bizarre. I think it's also worth emphasizing that one of the things that was really striking is that according to the reporting from Cal Rosenberg at the Times, the deal doesn't include anything about reassurances that the detainees will not be held in solitary confinement, which was early on, I think was reported was one of the things that was under negotiation. That, to me, at least, sounds like a pretty big concession by the defense. I mean, Ben, you've been watching this for far longer than I have, so I'm curious for your thoughts there. But it really seems like this was a good deal and the outcome that you would want given everything that we've gotten through to get here. And the fact that the Defense Department scotched it is unbelievably discouraging.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And just to double down, like to underscore the extent to which this is not a surprise, we've written about this exact ongoing negotiations and the basic contours of it for years. I wrote a piece in 2018 about when former President Trump removed Harvey Rishikoff as the convening authority because he was engaged in negotiations leading to this, where the waiver of the death penalty at the time was discussed and reported to be the major hang-up that for the Trump administration. There are other variables in play. We shouldn't ignore that. And there may be technical details of this sort of agreement. But I think it's strange to say that they have to come out as Secretary Austin appears to have done and say, no, this is totally unacceptable, when you knew these negotiations were ongoing for an exceptionally long period between the two parties. And to have not communicated to the military commissions or to the convening authority who he has since removed, that these sort of are constraints of what's acceptable. That's part of the policy process. I don't think there's an unlawful command influence concern there, in part because, of course, plea agreements are discretionary actions, right? And the approval of them falls under the convening authorities as a delegee of the secretary role. I could be wrong about that, but there's clearly a discretionary approval here, and the secretary the buck does stop with him, as he's now demonstrated. I think the context has to be politics, and there's reasons for that aren't totally craven, that I think are worth spelling out here. This is an issue that gets people really revved up and has a lot of political salience. I suspect Secretary Austin's very sensitive to that. Remember, this is a guy who's the head of CENTCOM. He oversaw Iraqi forces as they did the withdrawal, first the transition to Iraqi security after 2008 security agreement, and then the withdrawal from Iraq in 2011. All those situations involved huge transfers of large number of detainees and triggered all sorts of political flashpoints in all sorts of dimensions. I suspect he's very sensitive to it. And we've seen Austin be sensitive, or someone at least in this process, I don't think we know it was Austin necessarily, be really sensitive to this earlier in this administration when we saw the proposed transfer of another number of detainees who have been cleared for transfer held up because of the October 7th attacks in Israel, precisely because they were worried about the political optics. there was no operational concern that these people were going to go back and somehow be involved with Hamas. That's nonsense. They were concerned that it was going to trigger weird political cycles. That might be electoral politics. I don't think we should rule that out necessarily, about this becoming an unnecessary issue in the heated final months of an election. We've seen weirder things become heated issues in the final weeks of an election in recent memory, that have unexpected outcomes, and maybe it's not irresponsible to try and avoid that, although unfortunately how it
there's a James
here.
Comey. Now is your time to pop up with your opinion on the Gitmo plea deal.
There are arguments on all sides.
Actually,
I'm just
wait
putting
until
it out
the end
there.
of October.
I'm putting it all out there. The other, possibility that we have to bear in mind is that there's also the real risk of a legislative response, particularly in election year where a lot of members of the House are up for re-election and the Democrats are struggling to control the Senate. Remember, the military commission, the ability to close the military commissions, the ability to transfer people to civilian courts has been hamstrung by Congress imposing lots of constraints on a bipartisan basis, Republican kind of dominated, but bipartisan, that they work into the annual NDAA that is currently being negotiated. So this is a very opportune moment that if members of Congress did want to reduce restrictions, they could do so in the near future in a way that would, and very likely could, obstruct this. And the political willingness of people who might otherwise disagree with that to push back is likely to be at its nadir because an election is coming in just a couple of months. So these are all, I hate saying this because I think this is policy the wrong move. I think a settlement is the only way to end these cases. These people will never go to trial in this course of their natural lives. I am very confident of that, at least to trial to any final resolution. But I see the reasons why this is a political difficult moment for this agreement to have been reached. I think those people probably reached that agreement because this is when they got to agreement. I don't think they were doing it for political reasons. They probably, frankly, were operating in such a zone where so few people pay attention to what's happening in the military commissions these days. They assumed it would be a non-issue or it didn't really occur to them. But for Austin, who's more tuned into political sensitivities, I can see why he'd have anxiety about this. I don't think this is the best way to handle it necessarily, but I can see the logic behind it.
So everything Scott just said is exactly right. And yet the implications of it all are exactly wrong, as I think he will also agree. Back when Eric Holder tried to bring KSM and company to New York for trial, the system reacted the way Scott is describing. President Obama overturned him, and that was wrong. That was a mistake in retrospect. That was now, 15 years ago or something. And, we could have had resolution of it then. And yes, it would have required, weathering a political firestorm, but we would have been done with it at some point, unless the onion is going to be proved to be prophetic. Somebody has to stand up against the wind and say, the Bush administration was wrong. The Obama administration was wrong. The Trump administration was wrong. The Biden administration is wrong. And every single Ben Wittes in the world was wrong. We need to end this. And that the fundamental interest right now is in finality and getting this thing done. And whenever somebody does that, whether it's 10 years ago, now, or 10 years from now, there is going to be a full political firestorm. There is no convenient moment to do it. And it just needs to happen. And it needs to happen not by way of correcting past mistakes, because there's no way to correct them. It needs to be done by way of ending an episode that has failed. And Scott is exactly correctly describing the calculations of somebody like Lloyd Austin in this situation, I'm sure. But there does need at some point to be a higher value, and the higher value is getting this thing done and closing the box. And I say that as somebody who has, a shitload of skin in the game, all of which has been being on the wrong side of a lot of issues. And just somebody needs to get it done.
Well, speaking of a deal undone, let us discuss a major deal that was done and executed successfully this past week regarding a very, very different set of detainees that many of whom are now free, both here and in Russia and in Europe and other parts around the world. And that is, of course, the major exchange of prisoners or hostages, however you want to describe them. I think both terms probably apply fairly to a number of people involved in the set. of a number of Russian agents of various stripes, some cyber criminals, some fraudsters, some people involved in various types of smuggling technology to Russia, at least one assassin who is believed to have murdered a Chechen figure, a political figure in Germany, and had been convicted of murder and was in prison there. 8 of these individuals traded back to Russia in exchange for the release of 16 individuals, including Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, Paul Whelan, the former U.S. Marine. Both of them have been detained for a while, Paul Whelan for many, many years now. A number of other Europeans who have been detained into various stripes, and interestingly, a number of Russians, individuals who are opposition figures or journalists who have gotten caught up in this deal, and that the United States and European allies saw fit to trade for and try and bring out as part of this arrangement. A somewhat unusual inclusion to some extent, although certainly not unprecedented, particularly if you go back to the Cold War. Ben, you had a phenomenal conversation with Shane Harris and our colleague Eugenia Lostri about this exchange last week on the Lawfare podcast. Strongly encourage everyone to listen to that. I just did yesterday in preparation for this. I thought it was phenomenally useful. Tell us a little bit from your perspective, what you think the big important takeaways from this is. How big a deal is this? How big a victory is this for the Biden administration, who appears to have been a big driving force behind it? And what does it tell us about the incentives Russia has for engaging in this sort of conduct?
Well, so not just for the Biden administration, but for Joe Biden personally, who was very deeply involved on an individual level, and for Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, who, gets a lot of criticism for, everybody seems to think he's the reason why U.S. aid to Ukraine goes more slowly than people want it to. So there's a lot of, Jake Sullivan has a lot of detractors these days, in the Russia policy world. This is a huge win for Jake and for the president on a very individual basis. How big a deal is it? Look, I think it's a very big deal in ways both good and bad. The good ways are we settled a lot of family business. We got a bunch of Americans and Russian opposition figures whom we care a lot about out of prison, both very high-profile cases like Vladimir Karamurza and Evan Gershkovich, and Paul Whelan, who's been sitting around for a long time, and who, the world goes crazy when the Russians kidnap a celebrity like Brittany Griner. They don't go crazy when they pick up an American like Paul Whelan, who is not a famous person. But there were a lot of people in the administration who considered, Whelan has been in a Russian prison for 5 years, who considered that an important piece of unfinished business. We got it all done. There are still Americans there, but there are a lot fewer of them. And we also got a bunch of the Russian opposition who had been picked up as part of the repression surrounding the Navalny movement out. There were also other journalists, particularly, I don't know why her case has not attracted more attention than it has, but the case of a Radio Free Europe correspondent who was in Russia. She's a dual national. She was there visiting her sick mother, and Putin picked her up and added her to the hostage list. And so I think just as an accomplishment in getting our people back, it was a real feat. And what we gave up in exchange was a bunch of genuinely repellent human beings. You mention the assassin who killed gunned down a Chechen figure in Berlin, but there are also a bunch of cyber criminals. These are not people who it is remarkable how little parallelism there is between the people we released and the people we got back. We released criminals and our allies released murderers, and we got back political dissidents and journalists. And I think that's anytime you can do that, that's a very good day for American soft power, just sort of like what it says about us versus our opponents in the world. And there are circumstances like our last segment, Guantanamo, where we are not, have not put our best foot forward over the last 23 years. This is a situation where it is really like the optics of this are wonderful and we did a really good thing. Along the way, are we creating a market for kidnapped Americans? Yes. And, that could be you. So be careful what countries you travel to. I will not be traveling to the Russian Federation anytime soon, despite, notwithstanding my visa ban. Even if I weren't sanctioned, I wouldn't go. But you shouldn't either.
Oh, quit bragging, Ben.
Yeah, well, I'm going to slip that in somehow if we're talking about this.
Some of us were sanctioned first, for the record.
Yeah, Scott actually beat me to it. But you didn't get the Golden Heart Award from the president of Ukraine. So,
fair enough.
So look, I do think if I had been in the president's shoes or in Jake Sullivan's shoes, would I have done this deal in a heartbeat? And twice on Sunday. This is a really good deal. Are there collateral consequences anytime you negotiate with terrorists? Yes.
Alan, let me come to you on this. I'm really curious. Look, a policy response people have called for in response to this situation, and that I've argued for on the podcast before, is the fact that the only way you can really address this, because you can't pretend like you don't care about your nationals who are in these horrible situations. You have to do something to help them. I think pretending otherwise, the no negotiations with terrorists line was never realistic and would be pretty inhumane if we were to adopt that tack. The only thing you can really do is to, cut off the supply, start putting limitations on who can travel where and how we engage in countries that routinely engage in this sort of behavior, which Russia very clearly does now in a way that even 5 years ago, it was less clear, but now it's 100% a deliberate policy. You have a unique perspective in a lot of ways from a lot of us from our country, in that you have family from Russia in Russia. I don't know if you still have ties there that you're still in touch with at all, but I'd be kind of curious about your sense of how do you strike that balance? Like, what are the countervailing factors that make that hard? Why is it that, that might not be as easy a policy solution to implement, even with countries with which we have such problematic relationships like Russia?
Yeah. So fortunately, I don't have any family in Russia. They all left decades ago, thankfully. So these particular issues don't touch me directly. But, I think on your broader point, you're right, Scott, that I don't think that the we don't negotiate is a plausible path forward in a liberal democracy. I just don't think it works. Maybe it should. Maybe that'd be the kind of game theoretic optimal approach. And I'm sure there are tons of political science papers where, they model all of this. And that is ultimately kind of the quote unquote best solution from a, how do you minimize this happening in the future? But it's just not going to work. So I think you're probably right that the only way to really stop this is to put really substantial limitations on people's ability to travel. I mean, the problem though is that I don't know if it's feasible to drive it down far enough, right? So, what do? You ban all tourists from traveling. Okay, fine, fair enough. Do you ban all business from traveling? Do you ban any sort of cultural exchange, right? So you think of, Brittany Griner, the WNBA player who was, held hostage by Russia for, I don't know, it was a year or longer, but some lengthy amount of time. She was there playing basketball and that's an important kind of example of American soft power. Do you ban journalists from going? Well, you could, and journalists are obviously very attractive targets for this, in part because they're guaranteed to get, as they should, a lot of support from their journalistic institutions. What is the thing? Never argue with someone who buys printer's ink by the barrel. I mean, there's kind of a contrary, or a corollary of kidnapping people whose employers buy printer's ink by the barrel is actually a really good idea, because again, that really raises the salience of those kidnappings in the home country, as happened again very appropriately with Evan Gershkovich. So you could ban journalists, but then of course you're losing the ability for reporting that is actually very useful. So, although I'm sympathetic, Scott, with your proposal. And maybe that's the least of the worst options, given that, again, I don't think not negotiating is going to be an option. But I'm just skeptical that you're ever going to be able to squeeze the supply low enough that a highly motivated, capable foreign state actor like Russia is not just going to be able to, pick off enough people to cause problems for you. Because again, you just don't, Russia just doesn't need to kidnap that many Americans for it to get immense leverage when it comes to getting the West, or liberal democracies or whomever to release really, really bad guys.
Especially because it uses dual nationals.
What do you mean?
Well, so if you pick up American nationals, then you can say Americans can't go to Russia. And that's like the Cuban travel ban or the North Korea restrictions. I mean, you can actually do that, although doing it with Russia is very hard. But there are a very large number of Russian U.S. dual nationals. And, one of these people was literally visiting her sick mother. You can't tell Russian nationals, Americans, with dual Russian citizenship, that they can't visit their parents, right? And so if you have so little respect for citizenship of your own country that you will use your own country's nationals as hostages, if they happen to also be U.S. nationals, you're going to be able to foil any reasonable travel restrictions that way.
Yeah, I mean, I will say there's been, a lot of great reporting about Russia recently. I've been reading a really great series in the Post, which they've called Russia Remastered, which is about just sort of changes in Russian society, really since the beginning of the war. It's really striking. There's a lot of great stuff in there. And I will confess, I was pretty shocked when I scrolled down and found that it was reported out by people who are, according to the Post, in Russia, mostly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but are in the country. From the name, some of them appear to have at least some, Russian ancestry or family connections. It's hard to say beyond that, but it really did, reading this right after the Gershkovich swap made me really worried for these people. And I can totally understand that, big news organizations feel like they have some kind of obligation to keep people in the country to report, on what's going on there. It's a huge story. It's complicated because, this Post reporting was genuinely, interesting and revealed things that I hadn't fully understood before. But I also just worry about the incredible dangers for these people. I mean, the only flip side is, I guess my question is kind of whether the West is running out of Russians that Russia wants back. Given that, the folks who were swapped were kind of lower profile. There is some reporting in the Wall Street Journal, that came out just now while we were recording that there were 2 cyber criminals, including the person responsible for the TrickBot malware, who were sort of initially on some of the lists that were being passed around of prisoners who would be swapped and then dropped off them. So I guess those 2 guys are still in custody, and available for future swaps. But I do wonder whether, the usefulness of sort of this hostage taking runs out if there's just kind of a supply problem on the other end, so to speak.
Well, there's a flip side to that point, which is that, as Eugenia Lostri points out, this has terrible consequences for cybersecurity enforcement and cybercrime enforcement, which is independently an important U.S. policy objective. We go through incredible hoops to get custody of these cyber criminals, some of whom are responsible for literally hundreds of millions of dollars of stolen stuff, of damages, and then we trade them back, which, again, I would have done this deal in a heartbeat, but there are some people in the Justice Department who endeavored for years to get these guys extradited and then put them away for long periods of time, who were tearing their hair out now. We go through hell to get these people, and then the administration decides, and rightly, I mean, that's tragic choices are the essence of governance, that it cares more about Evan Gershkovich and Vladimir Kara-Murza than it does about deterring cybersecurity threats. Well, what do you get? You get a lesson in the Russian cybercrime ecosystem that you probably won't get caught. You'll make hundreds of millions of dollars. And if you do get caught, the Russians will take a journalist hostage and you'll be freed.
Well, folks, on that somber note, we are out of time for this week, but this would, of course, not be Rational Security if we did not leave you with some object lessons to ponder over in the week to come until we are back in your podcast device of choice. What did you bring to us this week for your object lesson, Alan?
So I brought this week I don't have it with me, a really crappy but kind of charming little pot that I made at pottery class, which I've started, which is my object lesson. My wonderful wife signed me up for a pottery class at our local pottery studio, Northern Clay Center, Northern Clay Works or something, which apparently is actually like worldwide, like world famous pottery studio. Who knew? But it is like in Minneapolis near my house. And they do these great classes. And I've been going now for a few weeks, in the evenings. And I'm really bad. And it is so fun. We're still in the throwing phase of the course. There's going to be some firing and then some glazing and then some more firing. So if I have anything that survives, I will bring it in. But yeah, it's a good hobby. I recommend it.
You're a crafts dad. That's good. Crafts are fun.
I'm just becoming a even more caricatured version of myself.
Quinta, what do you have for us this week?
I would like to be super normie and recommend the Olympics, which are always fun, but specifically the sport previously known as synchronized swimming, which is now, for unclear reasons, called artistic swimming, and continues to just be the wildest stuff that you can catch on the television. It is somehow, it is camp is the only word that I can use to describe it, but the announcers take it incredibly seriously, and this, beautiful swim, so meaningful. The teams, they have themes. They have to pick a theme. Yesterday, the French team's theme was women. Just like the concept of women. They had swim caps that had faces on the back of the swim cap. It was terrifying. The American team had one routine that was Michael Jackson themed. And they moonwalked upside down in the pool with their legs in the air. They had another routine where the theme was water. It was narrated by Jason Momoa. It is
really?
I am dead serious. And the thing is, from the announcers, I understand that it's actually an incredibly difficult sport because you have to stay synchronized with 6 other people upside down in the water with music that you can't hear, remain perfectly vertical, do all this kind of crazy stuff with your legs. Well, I guess making yourself keeping yourself up with just your hands. There's flipping around. You can't touch the bottom. So it seems incredibly physically demanding, but it looks so dumb. It is incredible. 10 out of 10. Highly recommend it. If you watch nothing else in the Olympics, please watch this. It's delightful.
I was going to make an argument that if you thought that was absurd, you have not watched Dressage, The Art of Horse Dancing. But Jason Momoa has not made an appearance in a dressage competition to date.
That's the artistic swimming difference.
That may push you over the edge. I may have to concede the L on this one. Well, for my object lesson this week, I am going to dip into a little movie recommendation that I got to watch the other week with my wife and really enjoyed, and that is the movie Thelma, which I think has gotten a little bit of critical attention lately. It is a very charming little independent comedy about a woman in her 90s who is fleeced by a phone scammer who pretends to be her grandson out of $10,000 and then goes on a quest to get it back from them, inspired by Tom Cruise doing his own stunts in Tom Cruise movies. It is quite funny in kind of a low-key, chill way. It is, like all independent movies, has Parker Posey in it, which is pretty much mandatory at this point. It's also got, I think it's Jeff Heckinger, is that his name, in it, who is Fred Heckinger, that's right, who's this young, I think very good actor who's kind of in everything these days who popped up. I was like, oh, this guy again. And it's the woman who's the lead in it, who actually I think is 92, 93 years old, June Squibb, is super charming, and very funny and does great comic delivery, great comic timing. great like slapstick to some extent. But more fundamentally, it is, in addition to being kind of family friendly and goofy and funny and kind of exciting, it's really, really one of the most empathetic movies dealing with the topic of aging, something that we really have not had enough empathy around the last couple of weeks, particularly as we've dealt with President Biden's decision not to stand for re-election. It's been pretty depressing, I think, from my perspective, at least, as somebody who, thinks about aging and has watched our grandparents age and pass away and sympathizes with the challenges of that. This movie deals with it all in a way that is both very funny and at times pretty lighthearted, but serious and really deeply empathetic, in a way that is a really hard combination to kind of bring together in a comedy that has it's heartfelt and genuine and genuinely funny, but it really does a great job. So highly recommend that movie, Thelma, again. Ben, why don't you bring us home? What do you have for your object lesson this week?
I will just say on Scott's object lesson that the issue of elder abuse scams is, among other things, enormous business. And on the Risky Business podcast, the folks there were talking about how these scams dwarf ransomware by orders of magnitude in the amount of money that they take from people. And so while a light comedy, it actually deals with a super serious issue that deserves more attention than it gets. My object lesson begins in Minnesota, passes through an emergency room, and ends up, as all things do, at the Russian embassy. I almost died this weekend in front of Alan Rosenstein. There was a bit of watermelon, there was laughter, and there was an incredible comedy act by Alan and Hannah's good friend Molly, whose name I will leave out of it. Molly did a comedy routine based on the things that Amazon is trying to sell her, which she has collected over the last month in screenshots, and she was showing the assembled company screenshots of the things that, based on her purchases, Amazon thinks she should buy. And they are screamingly funny. And the result was that I was laughing extremely hard, which you shouldn't do with watermelon in your mouth. I ended up choking, and my life passed before my eyes, and I passed out on the floor. There was an emergency room visit. All of that's notwithstanding. As I lay on the floor of Alan's kitchen, with the Heimlich maneuver being threatened against my chest, I thought to myself, what have I not done enough of in my life? What would I want to have done more of? And I thought, harassing Russian diplomats, of course. And so I came home and I found 10 pounds of chalk dust, and I brought it, and a hidden camera, and I hid the camera. And I brought the chalk dust to the Russian embassy, where I coordinated with the Secret Service and then dumped the chalk dust in front of the embassy and swept it in the form of a Ukrainian flag, and then went away to see what would happen, installing my hidden camera trained on the embassy. And sure enough, the next day, when the Russians could not get the Secret Service to remove the flag, and the Secret Service, God bless them, respected the right of protesters to draw on DC city streets, did not comply with the demand to remove the flag, the Russians emerged from the embassy with first a leaf blower and then a hose to remove the Ukrainian flag from a street over which they have no jurisdiction, in a fashion that the Secret Service assured me they would not do and did not have the authority to do. They did it. I caught them on tape. You can see the video of the Russians coming out with the leaf blower. That didn't work very well. May they choke on the blue chalk and have blue snot for a month. You can see them hosing it down in violation of international law, and on Instagram, set to music. And it's all because of what happened in Alan's kitchen.
I love it. As a father of a 3-year-old, I can testify chalk's a hell of a thing to try and get off your sidewalk. So it's a brilliant strategy. Well, it's something only perhaps a father himself could come up with who has wrestled with this scenario. I don't know where you got 10 pounds of chalk dust, but I'm not sure I want to know. So we'll just
Amazon.
leave it at that. Amazon. All right. Well, there you go. There you go. Well, that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Rational Security is, of course, a production of Lawfare. So be sure to visit us at lawfaremedia.org for our show page with links to past episodes, for our written work and the written work of other Lawfare contributors, and for information on Lawfare's other phenomenal podcast series. While you're at it, be sure to follow us on Twitter at RATL Security, and be sure to leave a rating or review wherever you might be listening. In addition, sign up to become a material supporter of Lawfare on Patreon for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits. For more information, visit lawfaremedia.org/support. Our audio engineer and producer this week was Noam Osban of Goat Rodeo, and our music, as always, was performed by Sophia Yan. And we are once again edited by the wonderful Jen Patja. On behalf of my co-hosts Alan and Quinta and our special guest Benjamin Wittes, I am Scott R. Anderson, and we will talk to you next week. Until then, goodbye.